Hi, everybody. Okay, so it's Tuesday, March 21st, and as we remember, over the weekend, former President Donald Trump wrote on Truth Social that he expected to be indicted today, and he urged his fans to get together and protest this. There she is. Gosh, Susan, you're so fast. How are you? I was just getting ready to read your whole resume.
Oh, well, I mean, feel free. This is my inaugural Instagram live, Katie, and I can't think of someone more awesome to do it with than you. So,
Well, thank you for doing this, Susan. You know, I have so much respect for you. Susan, by the way, I mean, talk about a power couple. She's married to Peter Baker at the New York Times. I last talked to you about your book, The Divider, about President Trump. And we just wanted to check in with someone smart like you, Susan, to find out your sense about what's going on and why Donald Trump put on Truth Social that he was expected to be indicted today in that case in New York involving Stormy Daniels and the use of campaign funds as hush money. So I guess the question is, it's a little after 5 p.m. Eastern time, Susan, and I'll tell everyone how smart you are later, but Susan has worked for a whole host of magazines and she really knows what she's talking about. She's written 3 books, and she's worked for the Washington Post. She's won 3 national magazine awards. Anyway, she's awesome. So, Susan, what do you think happened? This prediction of former President Trump over the weekend that he was going to be indicted. I guess, what was that all about, you think?
well, look, Donald Trump loves an enemy, and it does appear that Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, has now presented himself as, I guess, the new enemy number 1, at least for a while. He's not, as far as we know, indicted yet per his Truth Social post over the weekend, but it does appear that the grand jury is set to meet tomorrow in New York, and certainly the expectation and the political class here in Washington and in New York is that they will move toward indicting Trump tomorrow, but we're not going to see this kind of, transformative Trump shackled and handcuffed, doing the perp walk in an orange jumpsuit. That at least is not expected to happen tomorrow if it proceeds as other recent kind of white collar prosecutions have. What we would expect to see is that Trump's lawyers would negotiate with the Manhattan DA for a time and place of his surrender, and then they would do it. He would get a mugshot taken, which certainly would become an iconic photograph of Donald Trump. But I don't expect that, despite what his critics might long for, that this case at least is going to produce Donald Trump in handcuffs doing a perp walk in New York City.
So how would it transpire? I mean, let's say he was arrested in Mar-a-Lago, Susan. What would happen?
He would probably fly to New York, Katie, actually, in order to surrender. So that's more likely what would happen, that he would have to come to the jurisdiction of the Manhattan DA in order to surrender in this case. Again, we don't know the details of the proposed indictment yet, since it actually hasn't happened yet. It hasn't been approved, as far as we know, yet by the grand jury. So we'll get more details in terms of, what kind of, is he being charged with felony crimes as we expect? If so, what potential penalties do they carry? That sort of thing. And that, I think, will be a significant clue here, because remember, this case has been investigated and goes all the way back, in its origins to the 2016 election, and then has been investigated at least since 2018, when Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer and fixer, actually went to jail on charges related to the covering up of the hush money to Stormy Daniels. So,
right.
This is years and years in the making. And a big question that I have once we see that indictment, assuming it happens, is, does the DA have new evidence? Does he have new material? This was investigated actually by federal prosecutors earlier, and they declined to prosecute Trump on these charges. So what is, if anything, does the Manhattan DA know that the federal prosecutors didn't?
And do you have any indication of, or any idea, Susan, what took so long to investigate this? I mean, It's 2023 now, as you said. I mean, Michael Cohen, I guess, was investigated in 2018. So it's been, almost 5 years. What has I know there was a change in leadership in the DA's office, but can you give us some sense of why it took this long?
That is the eternal mystery, isn't it? Donald Trump seems to be investigated forever by everybody, but this would be the first time. And by the way, not only the first time that Donald Trump would face criminal charges in his long history of being investigated, and he has been investigated many, many times going back to the very beginning of his career, but it would be the first time in American history that any president has ever been former president has ever been indicted on criminal charges. So it really would be a kind of momentous threshold occasion for the country. But to your specific question, why did this case take so long? I do think the change over between the former DA Cyrus Vance and Alvin Bragg is one reason. Interestingly, this case, was sort of not going anywhere. And the other case against Donald Trump was moving very rapidly under Cy Vance, and that was the case against Trump dealing with his business and the question of fraudulent activities by the Trump organization,
right?
Which is something that his longtime former CFO Weisselberg went on trial for last year and was cooperating in the end with. Interestingly, Alvin Bragg came in and declined to prosecute a case against Donald Trump. He declined to move forward with the grand jury that Cy Vance had impaneled in that case. And two of the prosecutors who'd been working on it for years actually quit in protest. And so it does suggest that Bragg was not just looking to make any case against Donald Trump. Like, he looked at one case against Trump and said, no, I'm not going to proceed with that one. So it's interesting, given that he appears to be proceeding with this one. Does he think it's a much stronger case? Does he have new evidence that we don't know? It's really, very opaque. We have not heard from him in any detailed way at all to understand why this is happening now.
Yeah, it is so interesting, because I would think, just as an outside observer, that the Trump organization, and time again, you heard about failing to report taxes and to pay employees and all those things, that would have been potentially a stronger case. But that's not going to be pursued at all, even by New York State, by the Attorney General of New York State.
It doesn't appear that is going to be the case at all. That was a decision that Bragg took when he came into the office. Now, I should say, there are two other ongoing, very serious criminal investigations of Donald Trump right now in other jurisdictions.
Yeah,
and so
tell us about those.
We could have a remarkable case, actually, where within the next couple of months, Donald Trump is facing multiple criminal indictments in multiple jurisdictions. So, this would break the barrier that's never been broken of a former president being charged, but there could be additional cases. One is in Georgia. That is by the Fulton County DA in Georgia, still looking at Trump's alleged interference after the 2020 election there. Remember the famous phone call, the threatening phone call with Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, in which Trump spoke of, why can't you just get me 11,000 more votes?
Whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And now, of course, the former forewoman of that grand jury, I guess, is now world famous, courtesy of her many media appearances and her cameo on Saturday Night Live. So that case is a very real case. In fact, after the grand jury finished its work there in January, the reporting out of Georgia suggested that indictments were imminent out of that, but we haven't seen them yet. So that's one.
Yeah.
And then the most serious case, like if we're looking at the hierarchy, what lawyers, and I'm not one, would tell you is that, maybe you have this New York case is here, the Georgia case is here in terms of seriousness, and then you have these two ongoing probes that we know about being conducted by a special counsel of the Federal Justice Department. And those are very serious. Those are the most serious. And they involve, first of all, the classified documents that Donald Trump took with him after the presidency to Mar-a-Lago? Did he actively seek to withhold them from the National Archives and to obstruct federal agents? That's one aspect of the investigation. The other aspect is, of course, the whole deal, right? It's whether Donald Trump sought to unlawfully obstruct the peaceful transfer of power in this country, whether he sought to obstruct an official congressional proceeding. That was the certification of the 2020 election. They brought in a very serious prosecutor to look at those, a guy who has cut his teeth as a war crimes prosecutor. They brought him back from The Hague. Certainly a lot of symbolism there. But, you know, we were just talking about this the other day, Katie. It has already been as long since January 6th, without any charges or any resolution, of the entirety of the Watergate scandal that brought down Nixon, from the Watergate break-in itself to Nixon actually being forced out of office. And so that tells you just how very long the country has been in this sort of state of suspended animation, waiting to see if Trump will be held accountable for his actions.
You know, there's also Leticia James and her investigation. So, I mean, there's so many. She's investigating something as well, Susan. I think she's investigating Trump, 3 of his kids, and the Trump organization. That's more of a civil fraud case?
That's right. She is not pursuing a criminal case. She's already filed that in court. A civil case that essentially suggests that the Trump organization is a corrupt organization. And, you know, people at the time, again, who were looking for Trump to face charges, complained about this. She and her office have made the point, well, if this case, they lose this case, the Trump organization, that is very serious. They'd be forced to go out of business potentially in New York State, pay large fines. It's, you know, that it's not a toothless endeavor that they're engaged in, but it's not going to result in a criminal conviction of Donald Trump.
What's the status of that investigation? When will that be complete? Because we're in the state, as you mentioned, Susan, of suspended animation, waiting for, you know, the conclusion of so many of these investigations. And as you mentioned, it's been kind of a drip, drip, drip process.
You know, Katie, I wouldn't even begin to speculate. Donald Trump has made this a part of his playbook basically since he entered the working world in the 1970s. You know, take things to court, even file frivolous lawsuits, drag them out with motions, and play for time, use the courts in a way as part of your hardball negotiations with others. We continue to see that, I think, to this day. And so remember how long it took to get Donald Trump's tax returns, literally years of litigation that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So, you know, I couldn't begin to speculate, but it certainly seems like one of the reasons he was so quick to announce his return bid for the presidency in November of last year, right after the midterm elections, was so that to try to make life more difficult for any prosecutor going after him, and to try to claim that it's an effort to politically disrupt a presidential candidate.
Right.
That it's not just a matter of holding him accountable for history, but that it's an ongoing act of political sabotage or bias. And you see that, you know, in Donald Trump's many posts on Truth Social, and his videos, and his, you know, my email inbox have been barraged with Trump fundraising appeals ever since he announced over the weekend that he was going to be indicted.
Yeah. I want to talk about that and sort of what he urged his followers to do. But I want to ask you 2 questions about the ongoing investigations. Do you think the one that is being done by the Justice Department about classified documents, do you think that that is less strong now that other White House officials have come forward and said that they have also had classified documents that they perhaps didn't, you know, that they accidentally took after they left the White House? I can't even remember. I think it was Mike Pence. Who else? Joe Biden, obviously. They found classified documents, I guess, at his home in Delaware. So I'm curious if you think, and by the way, everyone, if you're just joining us, I'm talking to the very smart Susan Glasser, who is a staff writer for The New Yorker, who covers Washington, D.C., and has written several books, most recently The Divider with her husband, Peter Baker about the Trump presidency. Anyway, do you think that that investigation or those charges have as much weight given the fact that there were other, people in the White House who inadvertently or not did the same thing?
Yeah, Katie, that's a great question. I think that we don't know the answer to it yet, but certainly there are a number of lawyers I've spoken with who are concerned about bringing that kind of a case against Trump, and that it will be hard to make the argument about why it was justified to break with precedent in this particular case. Now, that being said, neither Mike Pence nor Joe Biden have given any documented reason to suspect that they were actively covering up the fact that they brought those documents with them inadvertently, or that they were actively obstructing either a federal investigation of the documents or the National Archives. And that is the allegation with Trump. It's not, the allegation is not, oh, gee, he had these documents by mistake and, we should charge him for that. It's that he refused to give them back. He may have lied or ordered others to lie to the government in its efforts to get them back, and that he actively covered it up, and that he may have actively, done so in bringing the documents with him on purpose. That's very different than the known fact set related to Mike Pence and Joe Biden, but it's enough to muddy the waters, and we all know that Donald Trump is an expert at muddying the waters.
Yeah. Has anybody seen what's in those classified documents to indicate that he was obstructing justice?
Well, what's interesting, and what the Washington Post has reported, is that some of them were highly classified, very secret documents that involved some of the top secrets actually in the American government. Secrets, according to the Washington Post reporting, that included things that were so classified that even many people with top secret clearance weren't allowed to have that information. So again, we're not just talking about kind of like randomly overclassified, memos of a conversation between you, and somebody, but some real intelligence allegedly is part of these documents.
Well, having said that, though, I mean, it's one thing to be highly classified, but do they somehow incriminate President Trump in any way, right? Because it could be highly classified, but is there anything that he's covering up in those documents that show him in a poor or even illegal light?
Wouldn't I love to know? And that stands to reason, but right now we don't know, and that's I think certainly one of the issues. There was also reportedly some information there in the documents that Trump was found to have possession of that included information about the private lives of American allies. And that also is very interesting, because I can tell you from having done the book on Trump, The Divider, he is a kind of person who actively seeks to weaponize information. That is his MO. It has been his MO forever. And one of the things that always gave, I think, intelligence professionals qualms about Donald Trump having access to all these secrets was his penchant for using it, weaponizing it, and seeking to leverage it.
Well, sort of Roy Cohn, and anyway, in his behavior. Susan, I wanted to just ask you, we talked about and by the way, if anyone has a question for Susan, you can put them in the question section. We talked about sort of the legal ramifications of all these investigations, but I'm curious about the political impact of, let's say, a potential Trump indictment. On Truth Social, I'm just going to read what he said. Now, illegal leaks from a corrupt and highly political Manhattan DA's office, which has allowed new records to be set in violent crime and whose leader is funded by George Soros, indicate that, with no crime being able to be proven and based on an old and fully debunked by numerous other prosecutors, ! Fairy tale, the far and away leading Republican candidate and former president of the United States of America will be arrested on Tuesday of next week. Protest, take our nation back. Can you just update everyone listening to this, Susan, about what the impact of those words have been and what your sources or, intelligence sources are telling you about fomenting this potential violence along the lines of January 6th? Or is this falling more on deaf ears? I know a couple of people have said, we're not going to do this. And so it doesn't seem to have been amplified. But what's going on with these protests? What are you hearing about that?
Yeah, I mean, partially we'll have to wait and see. It certainly was a strong echo of Trump's famous "Be There, Be Wild" tweet, calling forth his followers to come to the Capitol on January 6th, which I think the January 6th investigating committee did quite a good job of documenting how, that did have an important ripple effect inside the world of militia groups and white supremacists who heeded Donald Trump's call. And many of them had not been planning to come to the U.S. Capitol, but decided to organize to do so after that famous tweet. So, that's one great fear. Certainly, it seems that law enforcement in New York is taking that very seriously, that possibility. Nothing has happened yet. And now it's the end of the day on Tuesday, which has come and gone without a Trump arrest. So we don't know the answer to it. But to your other question, the other dramatic thing that's going on here, of course, is that Trump is actively seeking to use the prospect of his indictment by an African-American Democratic attorney general DA in New York City. He's using that. The divider is dividing. He's using that as an opportunity to win votes and sympathy among the Republican electorate. But certainly he sees political benefit in this. He's a master of the politics of grievance. He's also using the prospect of the indictment to force public testimonials and expressions of loyalty from Republican elected officials, many of whom might want to run against him or have sort of held their nose or suggested it's time for the party to move on after the 2022 midterms. And yet here they are once again professing fealty to Donald Trump and afraid of him and afraid of his electorate.
Yeah, I guess the question is, and as you know, Elon Musk tweeted that this was going to help President Trump. I don't think he's the only one who has followed that school of thought. I was talking to a well-known Republican consultant, and he said he agreed. He believes that if Donald Trump is indicted, it will help him politically. So, but where does that leave us? I mean, if he's indicted, how does that work in terms of being able to run a presidential campaign, Susan?
Katie, you can run even from jail. Eugene V. Debs, the famous socialist in the 20th century, actually ran a presidential campaign from jail. But of course, he wasn't exactly the front runner in that campaign and, didn't have any chance to win. The difference here is that Donald Trump has to be considered and remains the front runner for the Republican presidential nomination. All of the polls have shown that, despite all the hoopla around Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. Trump is still by far and away leading all the public polls nationally. And there's some evidence, in fact, that his campaign has gained ground over the last few weeks rather than lost it. And so, again, I have from the beginning considered Trump to be the front runner for the nomination. Now, the issue is, is this a situation where an indictment may benefit him with the Republican primary electorate while actually further hurting him in a potential general election? That is kind of the nightmare scenario for many Republican strategists and elected officials, and yet they remain paralyzed by their fear, or whatever you want to call it. But Donald Trump is a drug. He's an addiction that they can't break. And he's using the prospect of this indictment to once again, pull them back in.
One thing my team that helped prepare me with some other questions said that the hush money paid to silence Stormy Daniels, Susan, is only a misdemeanor. So what would it take for it to rise to a felony?
Well, again, we're waiting to see the exact language of the indictment, Katie, but the sort of understanding of people is that there are different charges available to the DA, and there is a felony charge of falsifying business records if you can say that it's connected to another crime. And the other crime in this case, as far as we know, would be the crime of filing false federal election reports. And remember, the whole point of the whole point of the Stormy Daniels hush money was to keep her silent before a federal election, the 2016 presidential election, right? You don't pay hush money in the abstract, or maybe you do if you're Donald Trump, but the point here is that it was explicitly connected with trying to keep this woman from going public with her story right before the 2016 presidential election. And actually, there were several journalists who knew about her and who were actively trying to report the story, including, according to my colleague Jane Mayer, Fox News, which sat on the story. And then, allegedly, Michael Cohen comes in with this $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels to buy her silence, to make sure it doesn't come out before Donald Trump gets elected president. So that's the underlying offense here. But again, there's, lawyers are concerned about that because that underlying offense is the federal offense of lying to the Federal Election Commission, basically. Right. And the federal prosecutors declined to prosecute Trump on this very issue. So it's, potentially it's, there's real issues about why the Manhattan DA is choosing to go ahead with this.
Yeah, interesting. Somebody is asking, and I'm sorry, the question is covering half your face, which indictment is the most serious and most likely to succeed in a guilty verdict? What do you think about that? Of all the investigations, of all the gin joints, which one do you think is the most serious and most likely to result in an indictment? That's a good question.
It is a good question. And actually, most of these questions are really hard to answer, but this one is pretty easy to answer. It would be controversial. It would be untested. But, when you have a federal war crimes prosecutor looking at you and looking to throw the book at you for January 6th, it would be controversial, as I said, and it might be an untested legal theory. But if they go after Trump and they indict him on that, that is a very serious charge. Essentially, it would be the charge of obstructing a congressional proceeding as a very serious felony, potentially, and of, essentially fomenting the insurrection. So if they choose, and that's a big if, we don't know, if they choose to go at him straight on for January 6th and, what he did after the 2020 election to stop the peaceful transfer of power, that would be certainly the most serious crime that he would be accused of.
Have to ask your opinion, just because I think it just is beyond belief that Kevin McCarthy gave Tucker Carlson all those hours of videotape of January 6th, and he manipulated them and made it seem like it was not a big deal, which was so ludicrous. I can't imagine, as a journalist in Washington, how you felt when you watched that. Speaker McCarthy giving access to only Tucker Carlson, and B, him completely and utterly distorting what happened that day. I mean, it's like crazy town.
Crazy town it is, Katie. And in some respects, I mean, this whole last few years in Washington, that was the term actually that John Kelly, Trump's second White House chief of staff, that he actually referred to the White House as crazy town, the Trump White House, because things were so almost Alice in Wonderland-ish. And, there's nothing more surreal than having the Republican Party decide to close ranks and to defend the people who ransacked their own capital, the capital of the United States, in a very explicit effort to stop them from doing their constitutionally mandated jobs. And, we all remember that day. It was a horrific day. It's an absurd argument, by the way. That's the other thing, right? We've learned through the filings in this Dominion voting systems lawsuit. We've seen the private emails and texts from people like Tucker Carlson, how much they look down at their audience, how much
he hated Trump passionately, and also how they all basically lied to all their viewers to get ratings. I mean, it's the most craven, hypocritical thing to have them saying it privately that the stolen election is completely bogus, and yet, you know, trying to convince their viewers otherwise. And I just don't understand. I guess many Fox viewers, I asked this political consultant I talked to this morning, they get their news solely from Fox. So Fox isn't saying this is what we did. It's coming from other outlets and publications. So many Fox News viewers don't know that their journalists straight out lied to their audience.
Well, that's right. And I think there's even been some surveys that have suggested that, that Fox News viewers are much more likely, to believe all forms of disinformation than those people who consume and get their news from other more independent media. But my point about Tucker Carlson and these January 6th footage that he's showing is that what an incredible insult to his viewers to show this footage and to pretend, to edit it and pretend, well, therefore nothing happened. He must really think that they're idiots who are watching this. Because, I mean, can you imagine, like, if I said, Katie, here's my exclusive footage from inside the bank robbery, and, that really wasn't such a big deal. And your proof of that was that you showed a bunch of scenes from the camera where nothing much happened because the bank robbery only happened for 30 quick seconds. And then you said, see, it wasn't very violent. I mean, here's the scenes from World War II in which a bunch of soldiers are standing around. Does that prove that World War II wasn't violent? Of course. It was very, very insulting, I think, to Tucker Carlson's viewers, that was the approach that he took to try to, kind of whitewash and rewrite the history of January 6th. And, it's a scary moment in our politics when people like that command so many followers who are willing to suspend, any kind of disbelief in order to follow along with what their leaders are telling them.
Well, Susan, it's always great to talk to you. Thank you for doing your first Instagram Live with me. It's kind of fun, and people can interact and send questions. I think I got to a number of questions that I was asking that some of our viewers were asking, and they're sort of tired of us talking about Donald Trump. They said he likes the attention. Could we stop talking about him? But unfortunately, he still looms large in the national political conversation, and he could play a big role in 2024. So as much as we'd like to stop talking about him, it's very hard to do so, at least for now.
That's right, Katie. Thank you for making that point, because I understand. Believe me, I understand. There's nobody who's listened to more hours of, Donald Trump, speaking at these rallies and ranting and raving. And it's the reason that Peter and I wrote The Divider. It's the reason, I'm still writing about this in my column each week for The New Yorker. Donald Trump, whether you and I or any of our listeners today pay attention to him, is the front runner for the Republican presidential nomination in 2024. He is not done and over with. And the element of wishful thinking, which again, I completely sympathize with, but this is exactly in some ways being underestimated how he was able to win in 2016 in the first place, in the 2016 Republican primaries, because people didn't want to pay attention. They thought he was a blowhard. They thought he was just full of it and that he would go away, and he didn't.
And I think journalists, if in fact he becomes a nominee or he becomes a hugely important figure in the next election, I think there's going to be a lot of soul searching about how to cover him and how to do it, fairly and accurately, but not get intoxicated by sort of the sideshow that he provides and the clicks and the ratings that he inevitably brings. And who knows if that will still be the case in the next year or so, but it will be an interesting time. I'm sort of thinking like, oh my God, are you kidding? But anyway, Susan, thanks for your intelligence and thanks for all your great work. And again, you can read Susan's weekly column on Washington in the New Yorker every week, which is redundant because I just said weekly column, but you know what I mean. Anyway, Susan, great to see you. Please give Peter my best, and thanks for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you to all your viewers.
Okay. Bye,
Bye.
Susan. Bye, everyone.